So how did you first get into composing?
So I first got into music as a performer. I did my first degree, my undergraduate, in violin performance. I did that at a music college, and I sort of had high hopes of, getting very good at the violin. I don't know if I could say I got very good at the violin, but I got good enough that I felt like I was playing the pieces that I liked and that I admired, and I was sort of being able to imitate some of the techniques of the players that I really admired as well. But I guess I've always felt a little bit like, just doing the thing is not quite enough. I always want to understand how it works. So I got really deep into kind of the analytical side of music, and eventually just got really deep into composing in my undergraduate, to the point where I actually did my final year as a joint major between composing and performing, where I wrote my own violin concerto, which was really, really cool. But then coming off the back of that, I decided that I really wanted to do film work, not for any kind of stylistic reason, but more because I also really love film. And I really love very sort of artfully made films. And I love David Lynch and Stanley Kubrick and, Jodorowsky and all of these kinds of like artfully and craftfully made films. And I really love the way that music interacts with those kinds of films. And I kind of felt like it was a very natural place for me to want to go. So I did my master's degree at the Royal College of Music in film scoring and went there for 3 years. And that was fantastic. And what I found was that having done a degree in violin performance and trained on the viola as well, not only did that mean I could write really, really appropriate string music much more fluently than a lot of the other people on my course could, naturally, but also I got really deep into recording as part of my process. So I learned how to record, I learned how to mix, a lot of stuff in terms of production that really influenced my way of working. So now every project I work on, I will always have live strings in it, or maybe if they don't have strings, I'll have some live instrument. I don't know if you can see, but I'm just surrounded by instruments here, most of which I can play to a good enough degree that they're worth recording. And, working at the RCM with live orchestras there and recording almost exclusively live players really gave me a taste of the advantages of working with live musicians versus sample libraries. I mean, you have to learn how to use sample libraries. You can't get through it without learning how to do that and learning how to do it quite well. And so I can do that, but it's like I just get so much more pleasure out of setting up a room for recording and just getting like a really expressive performance out of a real instrument. And of course, the other thing is that I obviously know a lot of players now as well. So really live recording has become just such a fundamental part of my process. And it all comes back to the fact that I was a player myself. And that's where I'm at. And then once I graduated, and that was in 2015, I spent between then and 2020 composing for theatre almost exclusively. Not for any stylistic or like deliberate reasons. It was just that was the work that naturally seemed to accommodate my style. And the work I do tends to be sometimes quite strange, or sometimes quite maybe dissonant in some ways, or unusual, or non-traditional a lot of the time. And that's the kind of stuff that really excites me. And the fringe theatre scene in London and like the avant-garde kind of fringe theatre world, they really love that kind of stuff. Much more so than like the typical film world does. I mean, obviously there are very, very creative filmmakers out there that do work on it in a similar way, but by and large, the kind of majority, the bulk of the film industry is generally sort of trying to be a commercial product. So there's only so far you can normally go with that kind of stuff. And typically in film, you'll get, very specific stylistic requirements, which, I can do and I have done. But, it's sort of, I naturally found myself working in theatre for a long time. And then COVID happened and theatre still hasn't quite recovered. So there are a few gigs coming up here and there at the moment in theatre, but I'm really at the moment, I'm really trying to refocus back towards film, just because it survived COVID and it survived it, spectacularly. It's obviously had to change a lot. It's all kind of become streaming now. Cinemas are slowly becoming a thing of the past. But as an industry, it's really somewhere quite promising. And, I still have all of the same love for film that I had when I was studying. So for me, it seems quite sort of natural that I try and move back there, because it's what I trained in, really, more so than theatre. And it's kind of almost like returning to my kind of original passion a little bit. So yeah, I'm really kind of hoping to move back towards film, and I've got a few sort of leads in that direction at the moment, but it's all quite sort of, it's a very liminal time at the moment, just because in a way theatre is starting to start up again. And I'm having to kind of face these questions about, you know, do I want to go all in on this again, or do I want to kind of take a step back and maybe focus a bit on rebranding myself a little bit, you know?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of different kind of opportunities, and different things that you're putting your hands into. I would love to learn about your process for composing for film versus theater. Are there any similarities that you have that are consistent across those styles of music, or not? Is it kind of a completely different animal?
It's quite interesting. Composing for theatre is actually much more similar to composing for video games.
Okay.
The reason being that a theatre performance is never the same night to night, you know? So you can't have a cue that's exactly 2 minutes and 12 seconds long with a hit point at the end, because you don't know if that scene is going to maybe take a bit longer this day or a bit shorter that day. So typically in theatre, you'll have someone sitting behind a computer and they'll be kind of hitting the cues, and it will be sort of, it'll be controlling normally QLab, but there are other programs that do this as well. They'll be handling lots of crossfades, and there'll be loops, and you know, there'll be certain stingers that happen on certain cues. And in a sense, you're designing a system that's kind of versatile, that can kind of be pushed and pulled around the performances of a cast that might forget a line or might add a line. Or I found that working in theatre really sort of for the video game work that I have done, having that background was really, really helpful. But in terms of film, really the difference is in the specificity of the synchronicity. So with film, there's a certain degree of synchronicity that is sort of a baseline requirement, you know, where certain big moments happen, the music has to know that happened. You know, you can't just have a 5-minute long loop happening on top of a complex scene. You need to react to the emotional narrative flow. You need to react to the visual storytelling. You need to react to the kind of all of these little clues that you get about the dramatic flow of this scene. The music needs to feel like it's sort of like a leaf sort of flowing along this river of narrative, which means that, you know, a lot of people say that, you know, Mickey Mousing is dead and Mickey Mousing is, you know, it's no longer stylistically appropriate. And they're right in the sense that, you know, it's not as noticeable. But I would actually argue that the level of synchronicity that you need to score a scene is hasn't actually changed. It's just that the way you react to those moments is a lot more subtle. So yeah, for me, it's all about reading the scene, understanding the filmic language, understanding all of these editing decisions and cinematography decisions and lighting decisions and grading decisions, and all of those feed into your understanding of how that filmmaker wants this scene to feel and to look, and how the flow shifts over time. You can't really do that with theatre. I mean, there's no camera for one thing, and okay, there are lighting shifts and things like that, but you know, theatre is a lot more like a kind of Lego blocks of sounds that kind of fade into each other, and there's only so much specificity you can do. And if you do really want that kind of specificity, which happens sometimes, especially in things like dance theatre, normally you write the music first and then they have to choreograph the scene around it. That's the only way you can really do that.
Yeah. And going back to film composing, I would love to learn about your collaboration process with other filmmakers. What is that like? I mean, what has your experience been in composing for film so far in your career? How do you understand what the vision is, what the story is? Like, how do directors speak to you? So to kind of communicate that, I'd love to kind of unpack that a bit more.
Well, the vast majority of directors I've worked with are non-musicians. I think that's generally true across the industry. Of course, that's not a judgment. Of course, they didn't train in music, so they don't necessarily understand the terminology that they're using. So a lot of the time they'll say things like, "Oh, you know, I don't like that clarinet." And what they're saying is that they don't like that instrument. But, you know, often what they really mean is that they don't like that melody. And they've kind of jumped on the instrument as the problem rather than the melody. Or they'll often use terminology in that kind of way that's a little bit abstracted from what they actually mean, just because they haven't quite got the vocabulary to express that. So a lot of the time it's really to do with, I try and talk with filmmakers on a very emotional level, on a very kind of intuitive level. So it's easy to get too analytical about it and to kind of sort of be hyper specific and hyper analytical. But really, I don't think filmmakers generally tend to kind of get on that well with that, because they don't see music in that way. They don't tend to see it in a very analytical or scientific or mathematical way. They tend to view it in a much more immediate, emotional, intuitive way. And that's normally how it sounds and feels. But they don't quite have the insight to realize that it's actually made with the same degree of like technical specificity as the camera work or the lighting. So I try and talk with them on like an emotional sort of level. I'll ask them about characters and how those characters are feeling, or how the audience is supposed to be feeling, or, you know, does this feel like an escalation, or does this feel like a resolution? You know, how does it feel? How does it, the product, the scene, the film, how does it feel? I find these kinds of like slightly abstracted questions tend to get the best outcomes. I do like to work with, you know, shared Spotify playlists and things like that, sort of building up like a library of reference material. I try not to lean on that too hard. I generally don't like to temp stuff into scenes for all of the reasons that everyone knows about. You know, it sort of presents a slightly inauthentic picture of what the final result will be. And again, you know, filmmakers are not musicians. If you send them a film with music on, they'll feel it very directly. And if that music is then going to change, you're sort of introducing a kind of an obstacle into that process of developing the work. So I like to use Spotify playlists as reference material, but I don't then cut that into the film. Or I might do for myself, but I won't show it to them, just because it tends to kind of give the wrong impression a little bit. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I haven't yet worked with a filmmaker that really knows music. And I'm curious about, you know, no doubt one day that will happen, and it might be a very strange experience. But for now, it's kind of like, it's sort of trying to, I don't know, it's almost like being a doctor and seeing a patient. You know, they give you symptoms, and you have to kind of figure out what's going on and prescribe them drugs.
That's a good comparison. I never heard it like that, but it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, because like all you're doing is you're giving them something, and they're like, okay, that will do it. But they don't need to know, you know, exactly why it works or how it works. All they're doing is they're telling you what the problem is.
Yeah.
So that's how it kind of feels to me, anyway.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. Do you have any particular film scores, pieces of music, or scores you've written for plays that are your most favorite that you'd be able to share and people would be able to listen to?
I did a score for a video game quite recently, which is on Spotify. It's called The Sorrow Virus. It's a nice score. I like it. I mean, it's not an especially listenable score because it's very ambient, because it's a video game. It's a sort of horror kind of atmospheric video game. So there's not too much, you know, music in there, but I like it. It sounds good.
Mhm.
And that's available on all the streaming platforms. Otherwise, what am I most proud of? That's a really good question. I think that I have a theatre score also from Inferno, an adaptation of Dante's Inferno for stage, which is also on streaming platforms. It's called Inferno, and it's under my name. Again, lots of those are kind of drony and ambient, but some of them are really thematic, and those are really, really cool. I tried to get this sort of sense of, like, because Dante's Inferno is obviously a medieval story, I tried to get this sense of sort of medieval sounding strings. So there's lots of like sliding and lots of like open strings, and there's an almost sort of hurdy-gurdy-ish kind of droning quality to it that I quite like. I would say that probably my favorite track from that is Geryon, the Winged Monster of Fraud, I think, out of all of them. All of the like thematic ones are quite nice. I quite like them. Yeah, so a video game and a theatre score. In terms of film stuff, some of my favorite work are for films that never got released, so it's kind of a bit of a shame. But
it's in the archives.
It's in the archives, yeah.
Awesome. Well, a couple more questions. Is there anything that stands out, any qualities that you think you have as far as your sonically speaking, I don't know, your approach that makes you stand out?
I tend to work with fairly non-traditional sound. And by non-traditional, I mean strictly in terms of orchestras, really. I very much can write for orchestra, and I have done. I would say I'm a proficient orchestrator, but when it comes to my own compositions, I tend to use instrumental combinations quite liberally. So it's quite rare for my work to just sound like an orchestra in a room, but rather to sound in some way expanded or shrunk or stretched just through the ways that I record these instruments sometimes. I mean, it's interesting how, if you record 36 violins and violas all as overdubs, which I've done quite a lot, it sounds different to a string orchestra. And it sounds very particular because it's all the same player and it's all the same instrument. So obviously there's advantages to having a real orchestra and that has the sound that it has. But this sort of overdubbing technique creates a really a very particular quality that it's really hard to put into words. And I think it makes it sound quite sort of, unusual. I think I do lean into unusual sounds. And I think that I like to do a lot with a little. So I tend not to have very long melodies or very kind of elaborate sequences. I'm very keen on using small fragments for making them sound really interesting somehow, and using those small fragments as sort of musical material. Yeah, I think my kind of particular way of recording things, the use of live instruments, but in a non-traditional kind of production style, I would say that's the thing that I feel makes me sound unique.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Like to do a lot with a little. Like I could see that as a quote right there.
Yeah.
Is there anything upcoming that you're working on that you'd like to share?
Well, what am I working on that I'd like to share? There are a few things that I'm not allowed to talk about. Obviously. What would I share? I mean, I'm in a band at the moment that's doing quite well.
Okay.
My band is called Modern Woman. It's a very kind of trendy London band. We're doing quite well. We're playing some big festivals this year, and that seems to be going quite well. Otherwise, the theatre industry is slowly getting back on track. I'm doing a play in October in the Fimbra Theatre in London, which is cool. I haven't written anything for it yet, but no, generally, I mean, things have honestly been very quiet since COVID hit. So I'm kind of taking all the wins that I can get and holding them very closely. But yeah, nothing terribly exciting is kind of on the horizon, really, which is a shame, but all in good time, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, COVID really did a toll on the music industry, and I would, theater is just, devastated. And it's good to hear that it's slowly coming back and where you are in London. But yeah, I felt so bad for everybody involved in the theater industry when it back in 2020 and 2021. So awesome. As far as top challenges, you had noted finding paying gigs and networking successfully. I'd love to unpack that a bit more and understand how currently you go about finding more paying gigs.
Yeah, it's a good question. At the moment, I'm trying very hard not to be that guy that you always see constantly spamming every filmmaking group with their show reel, because I'm convinced that they don't get any work by doing that. Again, I'm convinced that nobody really looks at those things because there's just so many of them. And it sort of became obvious to me that that's not really a viable route. It might work for some people sometimes or whatever, but it didn't seem like that was an appropriate route. So for me, and this was just trying to develop a strategy over the COVID period. It was like I was kind of trying to basically do first-hand market research to see what strategies work. How is it that I get people to kind of engage with me? And I found that the best way was to message people privately rather than publicly, and message people whose work I've seen rather than just a random person who says they're a filmmaker. Like I have to have seen their work and I have to have something to say about their work. And that's beneficial for two reasons. The first reason is that it means that they want to have a conversation with me, because everyone is self-conscious about their work and they always want to have conversations about their work. But secondly, it means that I'm only contacting people that I know what kind of work they do and that I've judged that it's appropriate. Because if I'm just spamming everyone with my show reel, I might be messaging someone who only does, I don't know, rom-coms, and that's not what I do, Yeah. So okay, we might network really well, but then I'll end up doing a bad job on their film because it's not actually where my stylistic tendencies will naturally lie. So that's kind of why I do that. And I found that sort of finding a specific filmmaker whose film that I've watched that I actually like, it's a very time-consuming thing, but it does tend to get positive interaction. Problem is, even those people are just constantly getting emailed, messaged by people, and a lot of the time it's difficult to get a phone number for some of these people. And it also feels a little bit like calling someone up is a slightly invasive thing.
Hmm.
I know that it's the way to do it. I'm very well aware that that's the way to do it. You know, if you really want to get a reaction from someone, you call them up. There's a kind of
Right.
part of me that instinctively feels like if I call somebody up and they're getting bothered by composers all the time, like immediately you set that relationship up on a kind of slightly negative basis, which is that I'm annoying them by
Yeah.
kind of invading their space with my voice. And I think possibly that's more really me dealing with my own kind of anxieties around that. But I do kind of feel like I would ideally call someone up once I've already had some kind of positive interaction with them, so that
Right.
it's more like a welcome, a sort of invitation into their life rather than a kind of invasion. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense, and I think you're spot on with calling people is the way to stand out for sure. But there's a time and a place for it, and
Yeah.
I think you're thinking about it the right way. My follow-up question that to those you mentioned reaching out, DMing filmmakers. I'm curious, is this just on social media like Facebook, Instagram, or like where are you finding their work that you are watching and you're like, oh, I like this filmmaker, I'm gonna reach out to him and see if we can collaborate.
So a couple of places. This is a bit of a kind of fool's errand, but I sort of do it anyway. I kind of do scroll the crowdfunding sites to
Hmm.
see what films are currently crowdfunding, and the ones that haven't yet got a composer listed are often, it's often not a bad idea to kind of message them, and almost always they already have a composer on board or whatever. But I do it anyway because you never know. But
Yeah.
also, yeah, Facebook groups, lots of like indie filmmaking groups. They're very prolific. They're very busy places. There's lots of people sharing their work there. A lot of people sharing trailers for their work. A lot of people sharing their crowdfunding pages. That's a good way of knowing that someone's in the process of funding something, which means that they're an early enough stage that they might be receptive to hearing from a composer. Otherwise, I'm also a member of the London Horror Society, which is a really cool little group of people who just love horror and people who make podcasts and films and TV shows and things like that.
Oh, cool.
So I've kind of managed to make a few good connections there. I kind of feel like the reason why that works, what was kind of remarkable to me is that when I kind of got membership into that society, I was the only composer in that society. And that
Mm.
really surprised me because all of the filmmaking groups on Facebook, I would guess that at least 70% of the members are composers. That's my
Right.
conservative guess. It was really odd to me that in this society, I was the only one that I could see. And I have a sneaky suspicion that the reason why is because you have to pay to join.
Mm.
And I don't know how or why that's kind of shifted the demographic, but I think that it's very easy to kind of post about your work in an area where there's no kind of upfront fee or you don't have to commit to anything. You just have to send something and whatever. Maybe you get banned or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's just posts into the void,
Right.
But with this
Right.
society, it's like, oh, you pay to join, you get access to the Discord, it's more of a like closed community kind of thing. I mean, it's not actually closed because anyone can join, but
Yeah.
by making it this kind of paid thing, it's sort of, that the people in there are really committed to this idea of being in this community. And
Right.
I think a lot of composers, especially, somehow a lot of them are kind of in a similar state of desperation as all of us are, where they're just I just need to send it to everyone all the time, everyone all the time. And they're sending their show
Yeah.
reel out 200 times a day to all these different people. And for every one of those emails, the significance placed on that interaction gets smaller and smaller and smaller because they just accumulate. And there's no commitment really to either of these individual emails to really kind of commit to that relationship kind of beginning. So yeah, I kind of think that might be a reason why. But yeah, so I'm in that society, and that's one way that I get work. And the other thing is that I still have a lot of contacts from the theatre industry. A lot of them have gone on to make films. A stage designer is a stage designer if it's for a film set or if it's for a theatre, So there's a fair amount of crossover, at least in the technical industries. So yeah, that's the other one.
That makes sense. Yeah, you do bring a good point. It's like even that fee, however large or small it is for that society, is
Yeah,
like enough of a barrier to entry. It like truly qualifies who is serious about being a part of the
yeah,
community, being a filmmaker, being a composer, versus yeah, it's so easy to kind of just spam,
mm,
your stuff out there, and like you said, it goes out into the void, and So it's a really interesting. I had never heard of that, but it's kind of, you bring up a good point about qualifying, everybody and making sure that everybody is like serious about what they're doing in the community.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's through like a paid membership scheme or any other thing, I think the valuable part is that you have a very dedicated community. Really, that's
Right.
the kind of that's the reason why it works. And these Facebook groups, I don't believe any of them really are dedicated communities. I think they're really sort of, at best, very, very big sort of notice boards where people just put their things up. And some people might interact, but there's no sense of community being driven there. It's really a kind of, very kind of liminal space rather than identifiable community identity. I mean, there's no reason why it couldn't be, but it just doesn't seem to be.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Awesome. Thank you so much, David, and we'll be in touch.
Cool.
Take care. Bye.